The sedan was burning when Brooke Sullivan pulled over. She'd been driving home from Portland General's night shift, still wearing her trauma scrubs under a worn jacket with coffee stains at the cuff, when she saw the plume of black smoke rising above Highway 26 near the Burnside overpass. Most people kept driving. Brooke cut the wheel hard left across 2 lanes, her hands already moving before her mind caught up, muscle memory from a different life, one she'd buried 3 years ago. The car was a silver Camry, crumpled like paper around the concrete barrier. Flames licked up from the engine compartment. A crowd of 5 or 6 people stood at a distance, phones out, doing what civilians do, filming and calling 911. Nobody moved closer. Brooke moved closer. The driver's side door wouldn't open. The interior was filling with black smoke thick as wool. She could see a body slumped in the front seat, a man with military short hair and a jaw like carved granite, unconscious or worse. She grabbed the passenger door. It opened. She crawled through the burning heat, her scrubs catching on the steering column as she reached for his wrist. A pulse. Faint and irregular, but there. She didn't think. She pulled. His shoulders were broad and heavy, his legs tangled in twisted metal, but she yanked him backward with the kind of strength that comes from having once carried a 240-pound Marine through the streets of Fallujah under machine gun fire. The smoke was getting thicker. The flames were getting louder. A sound like a jet engine spooling up the fuel tank. She had maybe 30 seconds. 28. 27. She got his torso free. His legs followed. She dragged him 20 feet from the car, her jacket lining catching on a jagged piece of the door frame. She felt it tear, felt something inside the lining shift and rip, but she didn't stop. She pulled him to the roadside just as the rear window exploded in a shower of safety glass that landed like ice on their backs. He was breathing but shallow, his airway already closing with fluid and swelling. Brooke knelt beside him, her hand steady as a surgical laser. She tilted his head back. She opened his mouth. She cleared the obstruction with her fingers, blood and ash and something that tasted like copper and diesel fuel. A small crowd gathered. Someone was screaming. Brooke's voice cut through it like a tank idling in a garage. "Someone get me the first aid kit from my car. Gray Toyota. Passenger seat." Someone ran. Someone else was still filming. She checked his breathing again. Better. His lips were starting to pink up. His eyes were moving beneath closed lids like he was having a fever dream, and then he said a word. Just one, slurred and broken. Brooke. She froze. 3 years. 3 years since anyone had spoken that name to her with that inflection, that weight of recognition. 3 years since she'd left that city, that life, that uniform behind. Tikrit. He was saying Tikrit. She could read it in the shape of his lips even as they barely moved. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She refocused on the 14-gauge needle in her hand, the one she'd just pulled from her jacket pocket, because habit never dies and a trauma nurse on night shift keeps supplies the way a soldier keeps ammunition. She found the vein in his left antecubital space and slid the needle home. Blood flashed in the chamber. She established the line just as sirens wailed into audible range, maybe 90 seconds out. The first aid kit arrived. She didn't need it. The bleeding from his femoral artery was slowing, his pressure stabilizing, his airway clear. She'd done this before, just not under the interstate, not in front of people with phones, not while hearing her own name spoken like a ghost by a man whose face she recognized but couldn't place because the last time she'd seen him, they were both in a different world. He said it again, quieter, Brooke. Tikrit. Brooke. You're going to be fine, she said, and her voice was calm and even and absolutely controlled. She removed the jacket, the torn jacket with the ripped lining, and folded it away from his sight line. The patch was still there, still sewn inside, still a secret. You're in Portland. You're safe. Paramedics are 2 minutes out. His eyes opened. Unfocused. Delirious. He looked at her face and then away, and then his eyes landed on something else entirely, his own left forearm, where faded ink spelled out a single word in letters that had started to blur with time and sun exposure. "That tattoo," he murmured. Don't remember getting it. Fever dream in Tikrit." She didn't answer. She was already standing, already stepping back, already becoming invisible the way she'd learned to do years ago when invisibility was the only survival skill that mattered. The ambulance pulled up, red lights painting the highway like an arterial bleed, and paramedics in dark blue uniforms poured out like a coordinated unit. She gave them the vitals with professional precision, alert and oriented to person but not place, airway patent, breathing spontaneous, 2 large bore 4s, no obvious fractures, spinal precautions indicated, and then she stepped aside and became nobody again. She watched them load him, watched the doors close, watched the ambulance accelerate back toward the city. Only then did she look down at her jacket in the dying light. The lining was torn. The sleeve was singed. And where the faded unit patch should have been sewn in its careful hiding place, there was now a gap, a ragged edge where the fabric had caught on twisted metal and given way. She searched the ground around the burnt-out Camry. Nothing. The patch was gone, scattered somewhere in that wreckage or on the roadway, lost to a stranger. She drove back to Portland General in silence, her hand still steady on the wheel, her mind already compartmentalizing. That wasn't real. That name wasn't real anymore. That life had been officially terminated, redacted, erased from every database the Pentagon controlled. She'd been ordered to disappear into civilian life forever, and she had. She was Brooke Sullivan, trauma nurse. She'd been that for 3 years, and she would be that for the rest of her life, and nobody, especially not some delirious Army Ranger, would change that. When she clocked back in for the tail end of her shift at Portland General, nobody asked where she'd been. Nobody asked why her scrub smelled like smoke. She worked the remaining 2 hours like any other night, stabilizing a diabetic in DKA, pushing insulin and fluids, charting vitals on the computer terminal with the precise rhythm of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She was exactly who she'd always been since walking through the doors of Portland General 6 months ago, just another nurse, competent and quiet and utterly unremarkable. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 weeks later, when Brooke was pulling the morning shift charts, she saw a familiar name on the roster for room for 08. Admitted through the ER on post-operative day from a thoracic surgery. She felt her jaw clench, just barely, just for a second, and then she picked up his file and walked to his room. He was awake, sitting up, looking out the window at the rain hammering Portland like applause for a standing ovation that would never come. He turned when she entered, and his eyes were clear now, focused, aware. He was handsome in a way that suggested military service, all sharp angles and scar tissue and the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "Good morning," Brooke said, her voice exactly as soft and deferential as it had been 3 weeks ago. "I'm going to check your incision. Let me know if anything hurts." He watched her work, her hands moving with efficiency, her touch professional and detached. His eyes never left her face. When she reached up to adjust his left forearm turned slightly, and she saw it again. That name. Brooke. Faded now but unmistakable, tattooed in letters that would be there for the rest of his life whether he remembered getting them or not. "It's a strange thing," he said quietly. "That tattoo. They said I got it during the fever dreams in Tikrit. But it's the only thing I remember about that city. Just that name, over and over." Brooke didn't respond. She checked his pulse. Steady. She checked his blood pressure. Stable. She wrote everything in his chart in her neat, precise handwriting, and then she turned toward the door. "You did good work that night," he said. She stopped. She didn't turn around. "On the highway. 3 weeks ago. Whoever pulled me out of that car, I don't remember your face, but I remember your hands. They knew what they were doing. Like someone who'd saved lives before." Brooke's fingers touched the button on the door handle. For just a fraction of a second, she let herself think about the patch, the one torn from her jacket lining in that burning wreckage. All the secrets that fabric had held. All the proof it carried of who she used to be. "I'm glad you're recovering," she said, and then she left. In the hallway, she could feel Dr. Sterling watching from the nurse's station. His eyes tracked her like a predator who'd just caught the scent of something wounded. He was standing very still, holding her personnel file in his hands, his expression carved from marble and arrogance. She didn't acknowledge him. She just kept walking, kept her shoulders level, kept her breathing even, kept the mask in place like she'd been trained to do all those years ago when becoming invisible was the only way to survive. But as she passed the break room, she caught her own reflection in the window. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. The person in the glass was someone new, someone she'd created piece by piece over 3 years of civilian life. Someone with no past. Someone with no secrets. Someone who'd just lost the only proof that she'd ever been anything else at all. 3 weeks after pulling the Ranger from that burning sedan on Highway 26, Brooke Sullivan sat in the trauma bay of Sacred Heart Medical Center with his chart spread across the medication cart in front of her. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless drone above her head as her eyes tracked the billing entries, not the clinical notes, but the equipment log attached to his post-operative summary. Surgical supplies. Listed twice. The same 14-gauge angiocath needles, the same sterile dressing packs, the same level 1 rapid infuser setup. Both entries dated the same day. Both at different price points. The second was triple the cost of the first. Her finger traced the numbers, $847 versus $2,541 for identical equipment codes. The procedure logs didn't match. No second procedure had been performed. Brooke had been doing this job for 6 months, long enough to know what a clerical error looked like and long enough to know what looked deliberate. This looked deliberate. She closed the chart. Opened it again. The entries were still there, bleeding out their contradiction like a patient hemorrhaging on the table. The antiseptic smell of the ICU wrapped around her, that sterile, almost metallic tang that had become the soundtrack of her new life, as she made a decision that would shatter everything. 40 minutes later, she found Dr. Sterling in his office on the 4th floor. The door was open. His desk was clean, organized with the kind of obsessive precision that suggested a man who controlled his environment the way other men controlled people. When she knocked, he looked up from his computer screen, and something flickered across his face, a millisecond of calculation before his expression reset to professional courtesy. "Nurse Sullivan. Come in." Not a question. She entered and closed the door behind her. Quiet. Professional. "Doctor, I was reviewing Mr. Garrett's operative summary, and I noticed a discrepancy in the equipment billing. The same supplies appear twice on the invoice, but the procedure logs only document one case." She kept her voice level, clinical. "It could be a clerical error, but I wanted to flag it before the final billing goes out." The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she watched Dr. Sterling's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. His eyes, grey and cold as winter stone, fixed on hers with an intensity that suggested she'd just kicked over a stone that housed something he'd preferred to keep hidden. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Controlled. Dangerous in its calmness. "You accessed the billing chart. I was reviewing his medical record and noticed the duplicate entry. The billing section is not part of clinical care, Nurse Sullivan." He stood up from his desk, moving with the deliberate slowness of a predator establishing dominance. "You accessed financial documentation without authorization. You flagged a discrepancy to, what? Who have you told?" "No one. I came to you first." Something shifted in his expression then, something that looked like relief mixed with the kind of calculated fury a man reserves for threats he intends to systematically dismantle. "Appreciate your concern, but I'll handle this. Equipment billing falls to administration, not nursing staff. And in the future, I'd recommend staying in your lane." She nodded. Said nothing. Turned to leave. "Nurse Sullivan." She stopped at the door. His voice behind her was almost conversational. "That kind of curiosity can be dangerous. For your career." The warning hung in the air like smoke as she walked out. The next morning, she learned that staying in her lane was no longer an option. The ranger's mother and sister were at his bedside during morning rounds, his mother in a cardigan that suggested she'd driven through the night, his sister holding a travel mug of coffee like an anchor. Brooke was reviewing his vitals when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, his timing too perfect, too orchestrated. He positioned himself directly between Brooke and the exit, and when he spoke, his voice was pitched loud enough to carry through the ICU corridor. "Nurse Sullivan, can you explain why you accessed this patient's financial records without authorization?" He didn't wait for her to answer. His eye swept toward the family, a theatrical gesture designed to draw their attention like a spotlight. This constitutes a HIPAA violation. Potentially criminal. And frankly, the behavior is concerning. The mother's hand moved to her purse. The sister's jaw tightened. Brooke felt the weight of their sudden suspicion like a physical thing, pressing down on her chest. The break room had been bad. This was calculated destruction. "I was reviewing his medical chart for duplicate entries in his operative summary," Brooke said, keeping her voice steady, clinical. There was a billing discrepancy that could affect his post-operative care authorization. "His billing chart, which you have zero clinical reason to access." Sterling's smile was sharp as a scalpel. "Are you financially motivated here, Nurse Sullivan, or just boundary challenged? Because this looks like someone fishing for information that doesn't concern her." One measured breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. The duplicate charges could delay his discharge authorization. "I was protecting the patient. The only thing that protects patients is staying within scope of practice. We have billing specialists for billing. We have doctors for medical decisions." He gestured dismissively, a movement designed to erase her from the room entirely. "You stepping outside that lane doesn't help anyone. It creates liability." The mother pulled her purse closer, protective of her son, protective of her family from whatever threat this nurse apparently represented. Brooke saw it in her eyes, the sudden recalibration of trust. One accusation, and she'd transformed from caregiver to predator in seconds. Sterling turned his back to her and addressed the family directly, his voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. "I apologize for her behavior. We take patient privacy extremely seriously. This won't happen again." He paused, letting the implication settle. "I'll be addressing this through appropriate channels." Brooke turned and walked out of the room with her composure intact, her hand steady at her sides. But in her chest, something had cracked. That afternoon, the break room became a minefield. She was sitting alone with her lunch, a sandwich she'd made at 5 a.m. because buying food from the cafeteria felt like marking herself as careless with money, marking herself as someone who needed to be watched, when two nurses from the day shift walked in. They didn't acknowledge her. They went to the refrigerator, retrieved their containers, and returned to their table. Then a resident. Then another nurse. The exodus was silent and systematic. By the time she was alone, the message was clear: contamination spreads. This happened again on Tuesday. Again on Wednesday. By Thursday, it had stopped being shocking and become routine, the way the room would cool when she entered, the way conversations would pause mid-sentence and resume only after she'd taken her seat, the way everyone else would find pressing reasons to leave within 60 seconds of her arrival. At 3:51 p.m. on Thursday, she found the written warning posted on the unit bulletin board next to the schedule changes and the reminder about hand hygiene compliance. The letters were printed in bold. Formal written warning, Nurse B. Sullivan. Insubordination and boundary violations. Final warning before termination review. A resident reading the schedule glanced at it, then at Brooke as she stood there taking in the words, and something like pity moved across his face before he looked away and pretended to study the break times with excessive interest. That evening, Sterling cornered her near the supply closet on the ICU corridor, where the lighting was dimmer and the hallway was empty of witnesses. His voice when he spoke was low and poisonous, the kind of quiet that carries more menace than a shout ever could. "You're the kind of nurse who thinks 6 months on the job makes you a hero," he said, moving close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive. Let me guess. Community college degree? Couldn't handle a real program? Decided to rescue yourself by playing detective. Brooke took one measured breath. The fluorescent light above them flickered once, twice, then held steady. A single tear escaped down her cheek. She felt it fall, that tiny betrayal of her body's response to months of work condensing into this moment of erasure. She didn't blink. Didn't look away. She raised her hand and wiped the tear with her thumb in one deliberate motion, and when her eyes met his again, they were steady as a sniper's sight picture. I've seen men with more integrity bleed out in the sand than you'll ever possess in a boardroom, Doctor. Sterling's smile widened. He was still winning in his own mind, still confident in his hierarchy of power. Sand? What, you watched her locker once? He turned and walked away down the corridor, his footsteps echoing with the confidence of a man who'd systematically dismantled a threat and could feel it slipping away like sand through an hourglass. Brooke stood alone. The supply closet door was beside her, and for a moment, just a moment, she considered opening it, stepping inside, letting the door close around her in that small dark space where no one could see what happened next. But that wasn't who she was. That wasn't who she'd trained to be. That was the nurse she was pretending to be, and Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan had survived worse than this. She straightened her scrubs, checked that her badge was centered, and returned to the ICU. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sterling was already on the phone. The code alarm screamed at 2:14 a.m. Brooke heard it from the supply room on the third floor of Sacred Heart, that particular wail that meant not a drill, not a routine admission, but a body actively dying. The ICU. Her ICU, though Sterling had reassigned her to MedSurg 7 days ago. She was there restocking central lines only because the night shift had called in sick and the floor was hemorrhaging supplies. The alarm didn't stop. It cycled. Cut off. Cycled again. She moved. The stairwell was closer than the elevator. Her boots, old tactical boots, still broken in from Tikrit, laced tight under her scrubs at the ankle, hit the concrete steps in a steady rhythm. Down. 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 The fluorescent fixtures above buzzed their mechanical complaint, indifferent to human urgency. By the time she pushed through the ICU doors, her heart rate was exactly where it needed to be controlled. Room for 12. The Ranger's room. The resident, some first year she'd seen around, name tag said Dr. Malik, stood frozen beside the bed, stethoscope hanging from his neck like a decorative accessory. His hands trembled. His face had the particular shade of grey that meant his nervous system had already decided this was a battle he couldn't win. The monitor showed pulseless electrical activity. Nice lines on the screen. Perfectly useless lines. A heart that looked normal while the organ itself had stopped pushing blood. The Ranger's chest heaved once, the last automatic gasp before nothing. Get me an 18-gauge spinal needle and a 60 cubic centimeter syringe, Brooke said. Not asked. The words came out with the same flat certainty she'd used when the walls were concrete and the explosions weren't on a screen, they were shaking the building around her. Now. Dr. Malik's mouth opened. We should wait for attending staff. Dr. Sterling is on call, Anne. He'll be dead in 90 seconds. Brooke was already moving. Hands reaching for the ultrasound, fingers finding the landmarks of the Ranger's chest, the xiphoid process, the midline, the space where life and death balanced on the edge of a needle. Move. The resident stepped back. Maybe it was her voice. Maybe it was the way she moved through the room like someone who'd done this before, which she had, but not in any facility that kept records. Not in any hospital that would let a trauma nurse anywhere near a pericardiocentesis. Not officially. The memory lived in her hands anyway. 17 years ago, Tikrit. Indirect fire. The surgical unit took shrapnel. 2 trauma surgeons down, 1 medic, Brooke, still standing in a tent that smelled like copper and diesel fuel and the particular stench of blood products that had been exposed to desert heat. A Marine Corps captain with a sucking chest wound and tamponade developing in real time. No physician. No attending. Just hands and knowledge and the muscle memory of a body that remembered what it had learned in the dark. She'd used a 14-gauge needle that day. Field expedient. Improvised. Saved his life with less equipment than most people kept in their first aid kit. This was sterile, at least. Cleaner. Easier. She prepped the subxiphoid space with chlorhexidine, the sharp chemical smell cutting through the antiseptic haze of the ICU. The ultrasound probe in her left hand found the fluid immediately, a black lake of blood where the pericardial sac should have been nearly empty. The ranger's heart was drowning. Pressure had collapsed the right atrium. 3 minutes of this and there wouldn't be enough cerebral perfusion to recover from even if they restarted him. 18 gauge. She held out her right hand without looking away from the screen. The needle appeared. Malik had moved. Good. Brooke advanced the needle with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory that didn't fade, that lived in bone and tendon even when the mind tried to bury it. 45-degree angle toward the left shoulder. Through the chest wall. Through the pericardium. The resistance changed. Tactile feedback, same as it had been in Tikrit. She connected the syringe. Dark blood filled the barrel immediately, venous blood, pooled in the space around his heart, stealing the room his heart needed to beat. She withdrew the plunger. Once. Twice. 3 times. The monitor stuttered. Then it found rhythm. The ranger gasped, that involuntary sound of lungs suddenly remembered they had a function. His oxygen saturation climbed. 74, 81. 87, his systolic pressure rose from nothing to 62 to 94. Sinus rhythm. Get me 2 liters normal saline wide open, Brooke said, and Malik was already moving, and somewhere behind her in the ICU hallway the monitor for room 412 stopped screaming because the body inside it had decided, for now, to keep living. She turned. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway. Had been standing there, she realized, for at least 30 seconds. Long enough to watch her execute a procedure that required an attending physician's direct authorization. Long enough to see her use equipment he hadn't ordered. Long enough to understand that something fundamental had just shifted in the power structure of his ICU. His face was absolutely blank. Nurse Sullivan. My office. Now. She didn't argue. She secured the 4 left-standing orders with Malik, who had found his voice again and was already calling for the attending surgeon, good, and walked out of the ICU with her hand still steady and the muscle memory of Tikrit still warm in her fingers. Sterling didn't go to his office. He went directly to the charge nurse station, where he made a phone call to a board member Brooke didn't know, using words like scope of practice and rogue intervention. Then to her nursing school, where he filed a formal inquiry questioning whether her credentials were legitimate, suggesting a pattern of concerning behavior. Then to the external investigator he'd somehow already had standing by, the paperwork appeared in HR by 4 a.m., flagging her employment file with unauthorized procedure performance and practicing beyond scope of licensure. By dawn, when the real sun started burning away the Portland drizzle, Brooke sat in the HR office with her severance letter in her hand. The paper felt like nothing. Like air. Like the kind of document they printed when they'd already decided you didn't exist. Gross misconduct and practicing beyond scope of nursing practice. Effective immediately. Your access badge will be deactivated. Security will escort you from the building. The HR director, a woman Brooke had never exchanged more than a greeting with, slid the folder across the desk with the careful distance of someone handling something contagious. Given the circumstances, we're offering you 2 weeks severance. That's more generous than policy requires. Brooke didn't look at the folder. Didn't open it. Didn't ask to speak to a union rep or a lawyer, though the phrase effective immediately meant they were betting she wouldn't. They were wrong about a lot of things, but right about that. She stood. 2 security guards materialized at the office door, not the same ones who'd walked her out last time, but their posture was identical. The institutional patience of people who'd been trained to remove bodies without requiring conversation. Her locker was on the 3rd floor. She packed it slowly. The cracked coffee mug that Marcus had given her 5 years ago, world's okayest nurse, in faded letters. The succulent he'd brought after her deployment, the one that never quite thrived in hospital fluorescent light but kept trying anyway, drooping leaves held up by pure stubbornness. And the photograph, the one she should never have brought to work, her team in Tikrit. 2007, 12 operators, 1 combat medic, 1 interpreter, 1 photographer embedded with the unit. 6 of the people in that photo were dead now. The rest were scattered, Colorado, Virginia, somewhere overseas, 1 in a VA facility in Oakland where he couldn't recognize his own children anymore. All of them officially erased. Brooke fit the photo into the box, pressed down slowly until the cardboard lid bent shut, and carried the whole assembly downstairs without looking back at the unit. The security guards followed 3 steps behind, professional and silent. The rain in Portland had picked up. Not rain, really, the kind of mist that hung in the air like the city was breathing it, like the whole world had become damp and grey and forgettable. She stood at the employee exit for exactly 3 seconds, letting the mist hit her face, letting the cold water mix with something that might have been tears or might have been just the rain. No one saw her standing there. The commuters passed without slowing. The cars on the street kept their headlights on even though dawn was technically happening. The city moved around her the way water moves around a stone, not noticing, not caring, just flowing in whatever direction gravity and habit demanded. She had survived worse than this. She had survived bullets and shrapnel and IEDs and the particular brand of horror that came from being the last person standing in a surgical tent when everyone else had stopped. She had survived 14 months of interrogation. She had survived the decompression chamber of learning to live as a civilian, learning to keep her hand still, learning to answer to nurse instead of her rank, learning to wear scrubs instead of body armor. But standing at the bus stop on Burnside with a cardboard box containing the only evidence she'd ever existed outside of a hospital system, watching the 15 pull away without her because she was still processing the idea that she no longer had anywhere to be, Brooke Sullivan, who had no official military record, no classified service file, no medals that anyone would acknowledge, allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of something that looked like falling apart. The rain hammered. The fluorescent bus shelter light buzzed. And somewhere in Sacred Heart, on the 3rd floor, an army ranger was still breathing because her hands had remembered something the world insisted she'd never learned. That wasn't going to be enough. Not this time. Security escorted her out at 6:51 a.m. The guard, the same one who'd brought Sterling his coffee every morning for 3 years, wouldn't meet her eyes. He carried a cardboard box, the kind used for moving files. Inside was her cracked coffee mug, a dying succulent with brown-edged leaves, and a framed photograph of her Tikrit team. Half of them were dead now. All of them were erased. The termination letter was printed on Sacred Heart letterhead. Gross misconduct. Practicing beyond scope. Unauthorized access to patient records. Every word a lie wrapped in hospital policy. She held it with steady hands as the automatic doors hissed open and Portland rain hammered down like shrapnel. Burnside Street at dawn looked like a watercolor someone had painted while angry. The bus stop shelter was full of commuters checking their phones, umbrellas creating a forest of black nylon. Brooke stood at the edge with the cardboard box tucked under one arm, rain soaking through her scrubs. The fabric clung to her ribs like a second skin, cold, heavy, reminding her of the weight of combat fatigues in Southeast Asia humidity. A woman brushed past without looking at her. Then a man in a business suit. Then 3 teenagers sharing earbuds. Nobody saw her. Just another person holding a wet box, another casualty of Portland's indifferent weather. The photo inside was from March 2011, her and 8 others in desert camouflage, standing in front of a Humvee in Tikrit. Their faces were younger then. Scar-free. She remembered their names. Remembered their mothers' names. Remembered which ones had kids they'd never hold again. The rain ran down her face. It mixed with tears she'd been holding back for 6 months, since the day she'd pulled that ranger from burning metal on Highway 26, since the day he'd looked at her with no recognition, since the day she'd decided that being a ghost was the price of being alive at all. She didn't cry like civilians cried. There was no sound. No trembling shoulders. Her chest rose and fell with the same cadence she'd used during night operations, breathing through the panic, through the loss, through the knowledge that survival meant staying invisible. Water ran down her cheeks and mixed with the rain, and nobody noticed because she was standing so still that the world had forgotten she existed. Inside Sacred Heart, the Ranger woke for the first time since the procedure. The cardiac monitor showed a steady rhythm, 82 beats per minute, perfect sinus rhythm, the kind of heartbeat that meant he was going to live because someone with hands that had held a femoral artery closed for 40 minutes under RPG fire had remembered how to save a life in the dark. Sterling was already in the hallway, already spinning the narrative to the morning shift. His voice carried through the double doors, smooth and reasonable. Unfortunate situation. She seemed so competent, but the investigation revealed credential irregularities. We're fortunate nothing worse happened on her watch. The residents listened with the careful attention of people who understood that one recommendation letter could determine their entire future. Nobody contradicted him. Nobody mentioned the pericardiocentesis. Nobody said her name. Brooke's apartment was quiet when she got home. The kind of quiet that happens when one person lives in 3 rooms and has forgotten how to leave things out. She set the cardboard box on the kitchen table and stared at it. The photo stared back. 12 faces. 6 of them in Arlington now, names carved into granite, benefits going to wives who'd learned to sleep without them. She thought about the unit patch sewn into the lining of her old jacket, the one folded in her bedroom closet, the one with a faded embroidered insignia that was the only physical proof left that Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan had ever been anything more than a ghost story the military told itself. The patch was synthetic fabric, maybe 4 inches across, worth nothing. It was also the only thing that could prove she was telling the truth. That her service was real. That the blood under her fingernails when she came back stateside was not metaphorical. Outside, the rain continued. It fell the way it had fallen in Tikrit 2, heavy, biblical, like the sky itself was grieving. Marcus came home from school at 2:44 p.m. He found her sitting in the dark in the living room, still wearing the wet scrubs, water pooling under the kitchen chair. He was 17, tall enough to see over the tops of doorways, sharp-eyed in the way teenagers are when they've figured out their parents are human beings before they're anything else. He'd noticed things. Her nightmares. The boxing bag she kept in the garage with tape wrapped around her knuckles. The way she moved through the world like someone calculating vectors. He noticed the cardboard box. Mom. What happened? His voice was steady. She'd taught him that, the steadiness, the refusal to dramatize crisis. He'd been 6 years old when she came home with the discharge papers and the new social security number and the orders that basically translated to, "Your mother's existence is classified now, please forget what you know." "I lost my job," she said. "Why?" She didn't answer. He was quiet for a long moment, watching her face like he was reading military maps. Then he said, "I'm going downstairs." The basement smelled like old concrete and the ghost of his childhood toys. The shadow box was behind the boxes of Christmas decorations, exactly where she thought he'd never look. Exactly where he'd found it 3 months ago, probably, the way teenagers found things their parents thought were hidden. The medals and ribbons inside caught the basement light. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart with 2 clusters. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. A Navy Cross in its original case. The kind of hardware that added up to a story nobody was supposed to tell. Marcus pulled the box out carefully, like it was made of glass. Like it held the answer to a question he'd been trying to ask his entire life. He was in the school hoodie when he burst through Sacred Heart's main entrance at 8:15 the next morning. The shadow box was tucked under one arm. His voice carried through the atrium like a bell ringing in a cathedral, "I need to see the Chief of Staff. Now." Security moved toward him. He raised his voice another octave, full authority, the kind of command presence that skipped adolescence and went straight to the bone. "My mother saved a patient's life here 2 days ago and you fired her. Someone needs to see this." It took 8 minutes. The shadow box sat open on the Chief of Staff's desk like a relic from a life that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The room filled with people who'd been summoned, the chief, the HR director, the head nurse whose hands had been steady in the ICU at 2 a.m. when everyone else was frozen. And Dr. Sterling, because the paperwork had to mention him, because his signature was the one that mattered. Marcus spoke first, his voice shaking with the kind of anger that comes from understanding that the world had just tried to erase his mother. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, United States Navy combat medic. She saved your patient because that's what she does. She saves people. Sterling opened his mouth. The chief nurse picked up the file from the shadow box before he could speak. Her hands were trembling as she read, her voice breaking on the words because she'd watched Brooke work and understood now what she'd been watching. 3 deployments. Tikrit. Fallujah. Ramadi. Field Hospital Trauma Specialist. Commendation for. She stopped. Started again. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. The Chief of Staff was staring at Sterling now, the way a person stares at someone who has just confessed to a crime. Boots echoed in the hallway. Synchronized. Heavy. The Army Ranger Colonel stepped through the doorway, the same man who'd been visiting his soldier in the ICU, who'd flown in from Fort Lewis for the patient transfer. He saw the shadow box and went completely still, the way soldiers go still when they're standing in front of something that matters more than breathing. Sullivan, he said. Just that. The name hung in the air like a salute. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. He stepped to the desk and touched the bronze star with one finger, reverent, the way someone touches something holy. This woman saved my ranger's life twice. Once in Tikrit during a classified hostage extraction, she held his femoral artery for 40 minutes under fire. And 3 weeks ago on Highway 26, she pulled him from a burning vehicle. And 2 nights ago, she restarted his heart when your emergency response froze. He looked at Sterling. After the 5th revelation, you don't get to speak, Doctor. Not here. But that wasn't the worst part for Sterling. That wasn't even the beginning of what was about to walk through those doors. Marcus burst through Sacred Heart's front entrance like he was breaching a hostile compound. 17 years old in a Portland Lincoln High hoodie, carrying a shadow box that caught the fluorescent light like a weapon. The box was mahogany, real, military-issued, the kind that held a life compressed into medals and ribbon. He didn't walk to the information desk. He walked to the center of the lobby where morning foot traffic moved around him like water around a stone. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, he announced. His voice cracked on the rank, steadied on the name. Navy combat medic. And someone here needs to hear what she actually is. The lobby went quiet the way only hospitals can, not silent, but purposeful. Nurses paused. A resident looked up. A woman in a business suit stepped out of the elevator, already taking in the boy, the box, the angle of his shoulders. Marcus had his mother's composure. Not the learned military kind, but inherited. Bone deep. 40 minutes later, that shadow box sat open on the Chief of Staff's desk. The room had filled in layers. First the chief himself, Dr. Raymond Hutchins, 58, 15 years at Sacred Heart, a man whose handshake could break bones but who knew when to fold. Then HR. Then hospital security. Then a Marine colonel in dress blues who'd driven in from Joint Base Lewis McCord the moment his soldier called him. The head nurse, Patricia Chen, 30 years of emergency medicine running through her veins like steel wire, held a file with trembling hands. Not fear. Recognition. She read aloud, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. Deployment 1, Tikrit, 2008 to 2009. Operation Phantom Phoenix. Deployment 2, Fallujah, 2009 to 2010, Jolin District Operations. Deployment 3, Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, 2011 to 2012, Task Force Leatherneck. Each name landed like ordnance. The colonel stepped forward, a man with a chest full of ribbons and a call sign that had probably saved American lives. He touched the first medal in the box. Bronze star. He moved to the second. Silver star. His voice dropped to near reverent. 2 purple hearts. He paused before the final decoration, and his jaw tightened. Navy cross. The room didn't just go quiet. The air pressure changed. The Navy cross wasn't handed out for showing up. It was handed out when you dragged your brothers through hell and didn't let go. Then the FBI agents walked in. 2 of them, building contractor suits and the kind of calm that came from seeing America's worst and still showing up to work. The lead agent, 45, scar tissue around his left eye, spoke directly to Chief Hutchins. Senior Chief Sullivan was part of a classified extraction operation in Tikrit, 2009. Operation Desert Red. She led a 4-person team through 17 kilometers of hostile territory to recover 12 American hostages. 3 of those hostages were active-duty military. 1 was an Army Ranger currently in your ICU. The agent paused. Let that land. The only proof Senior Chief Sullivan has kept of her service is a unit patch sewn into her jacket lining. She's worn that same jacket for 14 years because she couldn't wear a uniform anymore. Because her record was classified and then erased. Because this hospital asked her to be invisible, and she accepted that, and kept healing people anyway. Marcus sat in the corner. He wasn't crying. He was watching Dr. Sterling's face like a sniper reading wind. Sterling stood frozen by the window. Not moving. Not breathing. The kind of frozen that meant the architecture of a man was collapsing in real time. His tan had gone grey, a not sick grey, but the grey of something that had been exposed to light and was now withering. The Chief of Staff's expression had changed 3 times in 90 seconds. Shock. Fury. Then something colder, the look of a man realizing he'd been played by a subordinate for 3 years. Dr. Sterling, Chief Hutchins said, and his voice was the kind of quiet that made grown men flinch. I need your hospital credentials. Now. Sterling didn't move. Couldn't. The colonel moved instead. He blocked the door, not aggressive, just present. A wall in dress blues. Sterling's network, which had been so effective at erasing a Navy combat medic from her own hospital, began to unravel in real time. The chief pulled out his phone. Called the board member who'd vouched for Sterling's character when this whole thing started. The conversation lasted 60 seconds. I was misled about the situation, the board member said. His voice carried through the speaker phone, small and crumbling. I want an emergency board meeting. Immediately. Then HR. They had the investigator Sterling hired to fabricate discrepancies in Brooke's file. The man wasn't answering his phone. His office sent a terse email, investigation rescinded. Insufficient evidence. Procedural errors. The work product was being shredded. Brooke's nursing school instructor had already called. Patricia Chen read that transcript aloud, her voice steadying with every word. Dr. Sterling misrepresented my statements to him. I need to go on record saying Brooke Sullivan was one of the finest students we ever had. I had no idea she was a decorated military officer. I would never have allowed my words to be twisted this way. The FBI agent opened a tablet. Showed the chief the Rangers' billing file. Within 20 minutes, they'd mapped it, duplicate charges. Inflated equipment costs. A systematic pattern that added up to $847,000 in fraudulent billing. All of it dating back to the moment Sterling realized Brooke had discovered his kickback arrangement with the supply company. This isn't a termination issue, the lead agent said. His voice was flat, final. This is federal fraud. The patient is active duty military. That's interstate commerce violations plus healthcare fraud. That's prison time. Sterling tried to move. To leave. The colonel didn't step aside. You're not dismissed, the colonel said. The resident who'd watched Brooke perform the pericardiocentesis in the ICU finally found his voice. His name was Dr. Patel, 28, still learning what it meant to be a healer instead of a student. Dr. Sterling told me to document that he performed the procedure, Patel said. His hands were shaking. He explicitly told me to write that he was in the room. He wasn't in the room. He was in his office. More staff came forward. 3 nurses. 2 techs. A phlebotomist. They described private conversations where Sterling had told them Brooke was under investigation for theft and they should maintain professional distance. They described the formal write-up he'd posted on the unit board against hospital policy, never approved by HR. They described watching him orchestrate her social execution with the precision of someone who'd done it before. The chief of staff turned to Sterling. You have orchestrated a campaign of harassment. Defamation. You've interfered with patient care to protect your financial interests. You fired a decorated veteran to silence her. Sterling's voice was barely audible. I built this trauma department. 12 years. The chief didn't blink. You'll leave in 12 minutes. He nodded to security. The same guard who'd handed Brooke her cardboard box 2 days ago stepped forward with an empty one. His name was Jorge, 41, former Army himself. He looked Sterling dead in the eye and said 3 words that would echo through Sacred Heart for years. I believe you know the way out. Sterling's hand shook as he cleared his desk. His pen. His family photo. His monogram desk pad. No one helped. No one spoke to him. The silence was so thick you could feel it pressing against your eardrums. He walked through the hospital he'd once ruled, and every face, every single one, turned away. Brooke arrived at Sacred Heart 20 minutes later. Marcus had called her, frantic and hopeful, and she'd driven from the apartment in Selwood with her hand steady on the wheel even though the rest of her was coming apart. She wore the same clothes she'd worn to the bus stop on Burnside. Her hair was still damp from yesterday's rain. She walked into the chief of staff's office, and the room stood. The shadow box sat open on the desk. The medals caught the light. The Navy Cross gleamed like proof of something that couldn't be erased anymore. The colonel saluted her. She froze. 14 years of erasing Brooke Sullivan ward with the muscle memory of responding to rank. Slowly, deliberately, she returned the salute. Fist to chest. The oldest gesture in the world. 6 months later, the rhythm of Sacred Heart's trauma department was different. Faster. Sharper. Clearer. Because it was set by someone who'd held lives in her hands in Tikrit and learned never to drop them. Brooke ran the unit now. Her office door was open. Her team was tight, loyal, sharp as a scalpel. On the wall behind her desk hung 2 things. The first was the faded unit patch, framed now, labeled, Tikrit Task Force, 2008 to 2012. The second was a photograph. In it, the Army Ranger sat upright in a hospital bed, healed and whole, rendering a perfect salute with tears streaming down his face. Her name was still tattooed on his forearm. He'd added a date beneath it, the day she saved him on Highway 26. The date had become a new beginning. I remembered, he'd told her during the photo shoot. In the car, before I passed out. I saw your face and I knew, you're the Brooke from Tikrit. You're the one who wouldn't let me die. They'd both cried then. Just the 2 of them, in an empty room, remembering a time when being Brooke Sullivan meant being invisible. Now it meant being seen. Marcus visited her office after school sometimes, homework spread across the corner table, proud beyond measure. The staff knew who she was now. Not a problem nurse. Not a woman who'd question billing practices. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, the ghost who came back. Dr. Sterling taught CPR certification classes at Portland Community College now. Minimum wage. The fraud investigation had led to criminal charges, a settlement with Sacred Heart, and permanent revocation of his medical license. He was 53 years old, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy to students who would never know he'd once run a department. Sometimes he saw news stories about Sacred Heart's trauma unit, highest rated in the Pacific Northwest now. He changed the channel. Brooke's last patient of the evening was a young Marine, post-op from a motorcycle accident. He was scared. In pain. Far from home. She checked his vitals, adjusted his pain medication, and sat beside his bed for 2 extra minutes. Something the old Sacred Heart would never have allowed. Something only a leader could authorize. "You're going to be fine," she told him. "I've got you." He believed her. Everyone did. A medical student stopped her in the hallway later. "Chief Sullivan, can you teach me that pericardiocentesis technique? I heard you performed it under impossible conditions." She smiled. "Rare. Real. Tomorrow. Bring coffee." The student grinned and hurried away. Brooke stood in the hallway of Sacred Heart Hospital, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of antiseptic and hope filling her lungs. She was finally, fully visible. Not a shadow. Not erased. A leader. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If Brooke's story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated and proven them wrong, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments. What would you have done in her position? How far would you go to protect your truth?